We're talking about threats to effective group discussion. We've talked about conformity and groupthink. The next threat we'll talk about is group polarization. Group polarization is the tendency for homogeneous groups to hold increasingly extreme positions. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If I am a moderate liberal and my buddy Scott is a moderate liberal, and we get together and we have coffee and we talk about our moderate liberal ideas, after that discussion, we will both have more extreme liberal ideas than we did beforehand. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is just like, oh, everyone agrees with me. I can go forward, or I can push my ideas further. The other is that if I believe in liberal policies because ABC, and Scott believes in liberal policies because XYZ, after that meeting, I now have, or after that discussion, I have even more reasons to believe what I already believed. So if you're only talking to people who think and feel and see the world in the same way that you do, that often leads to extremist positions. How do we combat this? Well, one of the best ways is to bring in a diverse set of perspectives. And when I'm talking about diversity here, yes, I'm talking about ethnic diversity, I'm talking about gender diversity, I'm talking about even age diversity. I am talking about those things, but more than that, I'm talking about differences in values, differences in perspectives, differences in educational backgrounds, getting people in from different departments. We want as many different perspectives in the room as we can have so that we can get that full picture, right? If we go back to that metaphor of the blind people touching the elephant, we want as many people touching the elephant as possible, as many diverse perspectives on what this object is so that we can figure it out. One really effective way to do this is to bring skeptics into the discussion. So usually when we know someone is against what we want to do or has a different opinion than us, we try to keep them out of the process, right? One thing you can do, and of course this is entirely dependent upon the situation and what you're trying to accomplish, but one thing you can do is bring them into those discussions early in the process, because their skepticism, their critiques, their worries or anxieties are gonna help shape the discussion in a way where you come out with the best outcome. So we usually avoid talking to people who disagree with us or see things differently than us, but in reality, those people are great sources of information, and we should bring them into the discussion to get those alternative viewpoints. Even if we don't end up agreeing with them, just having them challenge us, make sure that our point is really well thought out and we don't get too extreme. Encourage everyone to play devil's advocate. So if you notice that your group always tends to agree on things, make it a cultural norm that someone's going to speak up and challenge it, that we encourage the group to challenge, see things from another perspective, take an opposing viewpoint, just to make sure that we really have thoroughly thought through whatever our idea or decision is, and thoroughly thought through what the problems with it might be. We're talking about threats to effective group discussion. We have conformity, groupthink, and group polarization. The last threat we'll talk about is obedience to authority. Humans are a pretty obedient species. Again, especially in the United States, we like to pretend that we're not, that we're, rebels, we think for ourselves. But there's been a lot of psychological research showing that humans' natural default is to defer to authority in a lot of situations. One of the most powerful examples of this is the Milgram studies that took place in the 1960s. I assume most of you are familiar with this. If you're not, you can YouTube it. There's a bunch of YouTube videos on it. But essentially, Milgram brought people into his lab and he had them electrocute perfect strangers. Now, the strangers were actually actors. They weren't actually being electrocuted. They were just pretending. And so the research participant would be asked to give this person an increasingly powerful shocks. And it would start out with the actor being like, "Ow, stop, that hurts." And then screaming to be let go, like, "Hey, this is super painful. Let me out. I don't want to do this anymore." And then eventually the actor would pretend to pass out and be unconscious. And the research participant would still be asked to continue to give them shocks. And most of the research participants were willing to go that far. Most of the participants were willing to shock the actor, even when they believed that they had passed out from the pain and the electricity. Now, I do want to note that there are some criticisms of the methodology of Milgram's studies, but overall, this has been demonstrated in other ways in psychological laboratories, that people are very deferential to authority in ways that, in ways where they will behave where they would never do it by themselves, but because they're being told to do something by an authority figure, they're willing to do this act or this behavior that they would personally consider immoral. Obedience to authority can lead to bad decisions. An example of this is the Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, where the space shuttle blew up upon launch. Now, I'm vastly oversimplifying this story, but essentially the NASA engineers knew there was a problem with the shuttle, knew there was a problem with the launch. However, this was a really important PR event for NASA. They were sending Christy McCullough, who was a grade school teacher, into space, and it was this big publicity stunt, essentially. And it was really important that the launch went off as scheduled. And so the engineers knew this was a priority for management. And so they were not as direct with management as they could have been about the problem. And they did not push back against the management as much as they could have when the management went ahead and made the decision to launch. And so you have this authority group, management, and they had this priority launching the space shuttle, and even when the engineers knew it was a really bad idea, they went along with it because, in part, because of the power of authority. And I think 6 or 8 people died as a result of this. So it was a very bad decision. Now, how do we challenge this? This isn't something that you can really challenge, within a specific group discussion. You can, and we'll talk about some ways. But really, this is about the culture that you create as a leader. This is about the rapport that you have with the people that you work with. And it's really about making sure that people feel as if they can come to you and offer criticism and offer opposing ideas to challenge decisions, and that you're not going to punish them for having those opposing ideas. We often stay away. We often end up not liking people that have different opinions than us, right? And we stay away from them. Avoid doing that. Seek out the opinions and the perspectives of people that you don't get along with, and make sure that they feel free to share those with you, because that's going to give you the most complete picture. And so this isn't something that you can fix in a single group discussion. This has to be a culture, a rapport, a relationship that you nourish with the people that you work with over time, where they feel free to come to you with challenging information. Another way to address this is to have anonymous communication channels. So it's really helpful to have a way that people can express dissent in an anonymous fashion. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable speaking up. They're worried about getting punished. They don't like conflict. They don't have great social skills in regard to expressing dissent. And so it's really important to give those people a line of communication where they can challenge you in a way that makes them feel safe. Likewise, when you're making a final decision, it's often a good idea to use a blind vote. So we've all been in committees or groups where teams where the leader says, okay, it sounds like we're all in agreement. Anyone disagree? And everyone just kind of quietly looks at each other, and then the person moves on to the next thing, where actually a lot of people disagreed. They just didn't feel comfortable speaking up. And so having blind votes, anonymous votes, where people can express that disagreement without fear of reprisal is really helpful to getting those alternative perspectives. So we're talking about group discussion today, and we started out specifically talking about threats to effective group discussions, group decision making, and those threats that we discussed are conformity, groupthink, group polarization, and obedience to authority.